Hello there, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to talk about the recently completed AP World 2021 written exam that was administered on May 10th. That's right, we're going to talk all about the free response questions. You can find the link to the 2021 FRQ documents in the description below. Now, in particular, we are going to talk about some of the possible answers to some of the questions, but more importantly, what I want to do is take a look at what we can learn from the questions themselves and how you can be better prepared for the digital exam that's coming up a little bit later this week and the additional digital exam that's being administered on June 3rd. So with that said, let's go ahead and have a look first at the SAQs. SAQ number 1, read carefully. Looking at SAQ number 1, we can see that this is a 3-paragraph source. And if we look down at the corner, we can see with the source, this is a contemporary document. So the World Revolution of Westernization is from 1987. So this is not a super old document. The first paragraph discusses a little bit about what the author believes Westernization is. Then it specifically points out that Western educated elites from non-Western societies began to take up the cry of freedom using Western values. In the second paragraph, he discusses how Westernization created anti-Western nationalists who were caught in a love-hate relationship with the West. And he finally concludes by saying that the revolution of Westernization had perpetuated inequality and ruinous cultural subversions while at the same time improving the material conditions of life. Sort of trying to straddle the fence there with that one. So now if we have a look at question number 1, the A, B, and C of this SAQ, I want to draw your attention to A in particular. It says, identify one non-Western nationalist leader whose actions might be used to illustrate the author's argument in the passage. I suspect that many students looked at that question and immediately thought of the first anti-imperialist leader they could think of and put that as their answer. However, this question is asking for a very particular type of non-Western leader, one that could illustrate the author's argument in the passage. And the author's argument in the passage is that, quote, Western educated intellectuals from non-Western societies. That is a very particular group that the question is asking for. And as just a side note, anytime you see nationalist outside of the European context, this is usually talking about the 20th century. So for example, a student who put perhaps Tupac Amaru, or a student who perhaps put the leader of the Sepoy Revolt or the leader of the Boxer Rebellion would not be correct, because this is asking for a leader who adopted Western ideas and perhaps was Western educated. So answers that probably work here would be, for example, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, the Meiji leadership, or Emperor Meiji himself. And notice also that the author points out the socialist cry for social justice. This opens up a whole new avenue. You could probably talk about Mao Zedong. You could probably talk about Ho Chi Minh. The point is, you need to read this question carefully to avoid making a very simple mistake. This applies to the second question as well. If we take a look at question B, explain one way in which the world revolution of Westernization, identified by the author in the passage, disrupted non-Western societies. If we look very closely at the passage, we can see that the world revolution of Westernization occurred after 1850, not before. So whatever we talk about, we're going to have to talk about after 1850. So for example, things like the conquest of the Americas or the East India Company interfering with politics in India, even the Opium Wars technically didn't happen before 1850. So again, we have to sort of look carefully at the questions being asked in order to avoid potentially giving answers that would be incorrect because we didn't look carefully enough at the question. So a great answer B would probably be something along the lines of imperialism, economic imperialism, ecological disruption, any number of possible things, but it's got to be after 1850. So something to keep in mind. SAQ number 2, reasoning skills are not just for the DBQ. If we take a look at SAQ number 2, we can see that it is in fact an image, something that we should definitely be prepared for on an SAQ question. Here in particular, we see what looks to be a pyramid or some sort of perhaps podium with women, and then there is a description underneath each woman. And if we look at the bottom, we can see a translation where it shows various roles that women have played. Now, if we flip over to the breakdown of question number 2, the A, B, and C, we can quickly see that A and B are relatively straightforward, as they simply ask for an identification and no explanation. So thinking, change, and continuity. But if we look at question number 3, it's asking about the format or the intended audience. Now, this is the kind of thing we would normally think about applying to a DBQ. We wouldn't normally think about applying this to an SAQ, but we should always be automatically thinking these kinds of things when we look at any source, no matter what it is, thinking about the author, the audience, the context, or the purpose. So for example, when looking at the format, if you flip on back, you can see in the title, it describes it as a mass-produced poster offered for sale to individuals and institutions. So perhaps it's mass-produced in nature, and it was to be spread and distributed widely. Institutions could potentially mean anything. Maybe that means schools. Maybe that means hospitals. Maybe that means churches. It's hard to say. That word there, institutions, is purposely broad so that you can make the argument any way you wish. Now, the intended audience, who was meant to see this? Well, what a good question. Noting that a lot of the descriptions are in the first person, perhaps this is aimed at an audience of women who might find this relatable. Could also be aimed at an audience of men in order to raise awareness about the various roles women play in society. After all, the feminist movement was in full swing in Europe during the time that this poster was produced. Or perhaps, owing to the large number of very traditional roles on this poster, this was in fact an anti-feminist poster produced to turn people's opinions against feminism. I don't know. That's your argument to make. Analyze and come to conclusions about yourself. However, my point is, we should always be thinking about those reasoning skills, even on an SAQ. If you look at number 1, part C, explain one reason why historians of the late 20th century reinterpreted Western imperialism in the way that the author does in the second and third paragraphs of the passage. This is asking about historical context. So what's going on in the 1980s or later that would lead to a reinterpretation of Western imperialism? So things possibly such as decolonization, changing discourses on civil rights and the roles of people in society, maybe globalization, all things that were happening in the 1980s that may have had an influence on this particular document. Again, the point is we should always, always, always apply our reasoning skills to any source, no matter whether it's in a DBQ or in an SAQ. SAQ questions 3 and 4 think about the course in terms of themes. Both question 3 and 4 focus on both politics and economics. As a student of AP World, you probably are inundated with facts, and facts are important. There's nothing wrong with facts, but it's important to keep those big themes in mind, and that's what question 3 and 4 remind us to do. So in order to effectively answer these questions, you may need to keep in mind themes of the global economy in the earlier units of the course, or the global economy in the later units of the course, as well as the interactions between economic activity and political activity. So because you have a choice here, you're not necessarily limited to one of the questions. So for example, if you know more about China, you'd go for question number 3, which asks about China. Or if you know more about South and Southeast Asia, you might go for question 4, which talks about South and Southeast Asia. But either way, you're going to have to know a little bit about the global economy in general. The point is, information is important, but questions 3 and 4 remind us to think broadly and think thematically. The LEQs look at the learning objectives. So even though the digital exam administered either on May 20th or June 3rd will not have an LEQ on, I would like to draw your attention to the LEQ for future references. So for example, if you look at 2, 3, and 4, almost all of these prompts directly reflect either a learning objective or a historical development from the course description. So let's take a look at number 2 really quick. Number 2 says, develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which developments in economic and or commercial practices in Afro-Eurasia affected trade in this period. Compare this with historical developments from Unit 2.1. Quote, improved commercial practices led to an increased volume of trade and expanded the geographic range of existing trade routes, promoting the growth of powerful new trading cities. That is verbatim, almost an answer to this question. Now, of course, because the prompt specifically mentions the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean, and the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, there's obviously more than just the Silk Road. But as you can see, in order to prepare for the LEQ in the future, it would be good to study the listed historical developments in the course description. Now, before we go ahead and talk about the DBQ, I want to sort of do a little sort of meta commentary on it really quick before we go in. So the day after these prompts were released, I looked on a number of teacher social media forums that I happen to belong to, and there was a lot of, well, thoughts on exactly this particular prompt. And as teachers, of course, we like to articulate our feelings of either irritation, annoyance, or sadness in very articulate manners, such as this, or perhaps this. But sometimes we just let it all out, like this. Somebody bringing the fries. We got some salt up in here. But to be absolutely fair to teachers, it's been a very hard year, and I don't blame anyone for thinking that perhaps the College Board's topic for this DBQ, that is the Mexican Revolution, was perhaps too obscure or unfair, especially compared to, say, AP Euro's DBQ topic, which I believe is about India and imperialism, pretty run-of-the-mill for that course. But that said, I think this also highlights something that we tend to forget, which is that you don't actually have to know that much about the DBQ in order to do well on the DBQ. Now, I'll break down exactly what I mean in just a second, but I'd also like to just point out that I have written 2 responses to this DBQ. Full essay responses to the DBQ, they're found in the description below, so feel free to have a look. Get yourself a copy if you'd like to follow along. The link to the DBQ itself is also there. But with that said, let's have a look at these documents. There's a couple of key things to keep in mind. The first thing I'd like to look at is the prompt. Quote, evaluate the extent to which economic factors led to the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. Now, a lot of teachers have freaked out because they may not have covered this as explicitly as, say, other major revolutions like the Atlantic revolutions. But here's the thing, you don't actually have to know that much about the Mexican Revolution in order to do well. This is something we tend to forget, but the documents, all 7 of them, are all you really need, apart from a little bit of maybe general knowledge, history of the time period. And well, you've just taken a history class for an entire year, so certainly you have a little knowledge of the general time period. Between all the sources, which include things such as charts, travel logs, newspaper articles, and pictures, you have more than enough to write a full essay here without having to know much at all about the Mexican Revolution. The documents give you what you need. By the way, if I can just, as a side tangent, draw your attention to document number 6, I went and looked up the author of the document, Ricardo Flores Magon. The College Board document here describes him as an intellectual and a social reformer. I looked this up because I was a little curious. Dude was an anarchist and led one of the first revolts against Porfirio Diaz. Way to describe an anarchist, someone who literally wants to destroy the system, as a social reformer. College Board, can you try not to be a faceless megacorporation shilling for the current economic system? Oh, wait a minute. One other way to try to tamp down on some of this fear I think we see with a DBQ of the topic we don't really know that much about is to remember that within each document, you don't necessarily have to use the entire document. Most of these documents are 1 to 2 paragraphs, or in the case of document 7, it's a song with several verses. The point is, you can zoom in and narrow in on just one part of the document and use it to make your argument. You don't need to use the whole thing. As you can see from a couple of the examples I have linked in the description, let's take document number 4 as an example. This is the travel log written by the American who toured Mexico the year that the revolution started. There's a lot in this document. So for example, there's a great part of this document that talks about the production of hinikin, which is a sort of agave plant that produces very tough fibers that were in general demand in the United States, as can be seen at the asterisk at the bottom of the paper. You could focus in on that and discuss the global economic significance of Mexico during this time, or perhaps the economic imperialism that might be connected to acquisition of this plant by European manufacturers. Or perhaps you want to point out the coercive labor practice, a kind of debt servitude or debt bondage that is described, and discuss this injustice and theft of labor as one of the economic causes of the revolution. Or perhaps you may want to focus in on the displacement of Native Americans from their land, or maybe you want to talk about the probable importation of labor from China and Korea in order to undercut the ability of native laborers to organize. That's a bit of a stretch on my part. It doesn't actually say that. But the point is, with document 4, you could pick any one of those things and zoom in on it. You don't have to try to fit the entire document into your essay. And I think we forget that sometimes. But in making an argument, you can pick the stronger evidence to make your argument. And especially if you're crunched for time, you don't need to feel pressure to use the entire document. These 2 lessons, 1, that the documents are literally all you need, and 2, that you don't have to use every single part of every single document, are 2 things you should keep in mind going into the DBQ that will help you do well, even if you don't know a lot about the topic, and prevent you from getting bogged down interpreting and organizing. I hope this sort of rough overview about the lessons we can take away from the 2021 FRQs has given you a bit of confidence, or perhaps put your mind slightly at ease about the upcoming exam. And hey, if you want to study a little bit more, check out my other videos. I cover much of the AP World content. I'm sure you'll find whatever you need there. And hey, if you like what you see, maybe consider liking and subscribing. But I want to thank you for joining me now. My name is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.